Over this past weekend, we saw some giants stumble while teams rose to the occasion. We saw some near collapses turn into insane comebacks that could define a team's season. And we saw some underdogs fight tooth and nail to keep their playoff hopes alive. With only 2 weeks left, we still have a staggering 34 teams vying for one of the 12 spots in the playoffs. As always, we'll separate the remaining 34 teams into mortal locks, lock bar and collapse, control their destiny, need a little luck, and pray. But first, let's recognize the fallen. Every single one of these teams lost, which killed their chances of making a run at the playoffs. While it is still mathematically possible for Duke to win the ACC, I just don't see a world where they could get into the playoffs with 5 losses. So no real shockers in this bunch, but we feel for them all the same. So moving into the teams with an actual chance, we finally have our first mortal lock of the season, Indiana. Let me take you back. It's only 2 years ago in 2023. Indiana is 1-2 on the year, and for whatever reason, you're watching them go to 4 overtimes with Akron. Their quarterback, who weirdly happens to be Warriors forward Trace Jackson Davis's brother, has a completion percentage in the 40s, and this team barely looks FBS level, let alone Power 4 level. You watch them win the game, but it's a game that leaves a really sour taste in your mouth. You understand why this is the losingest team in college football history. Now imagine someone tells you after that game that this program will hire a 62-year-old who has never been the head coach at a major school and will lead them to back-to-back college football playoffs. They also tell you that this will be the first team to guarantee what will most likely be a first-round bye with the Heisman favorite at quarterback. You would look at them like they had 4 heads, but I guess truth is stranger than fiction. Indiana will be in the playoffs this year no matter what. They only have 1 game remaining against Purdue, and the Boilermakers could slap them by around 50 points, and it wouldn't be enough to keep them out. There are a lot of non-believers in this team out there, and I get it. Only major win in 2 years is at Oregon, who they themselves haven't really beaten a top team this year. But for now, this is the only team whose spot is wrapped up, regardless of whether or not people believe they'll even stand a chance in their first game. Moving into lock bar and collapse, we have 2 teams that would be with Indiana if they only had 1 game left, Ohio State and Texas A&M. You could argue that both of these teams would still make it even if they lost the last 2 games remaining on their schedule, but we would really just be splitting hairs at that point because we all know these 2 teams are going to make it, more than likely with byes. Ohio State breezed by UCLA, but things weren't so easy for Texas A&M. I was watching this first half in complete and utter disbelief. We knew South Carolina would have a solid defense, but it just seemed like everything was going their way. 30-3 at half. That's a scoreline I would expect from one of the SEC teams playing against their average FCS school. Not a team with 1 conference win going up against a title favorite. And I know people are going to be quick to mention that they never should have found themselves in that position to begin with to need to mount such an absurd comeback, and you're right. But games like this are the mark of great teams. When you're playing god-awful and everything is going wrong, how do you respond? Do you roll over and die? Or do you dig in and throw for 440 yards? Personally, I would rather get that slip up out of the way now than in the playoffs. One of the biggest winners of last week, we have Georgia. I was looking forward to Texas potentially shaking things up, but Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldogs are just too solid. They completely took away the Longhorns' run game and forced them to rely on Arch Manning's arm. Even still, this game was a battle, until Georgia made one of the gutsiest calls I've seen all season with a 4th quarter onside kick. Talk about a gut punch. It completely sucked the life out of Texas and pretty much ended the game right then and there. Georgia can now rest a whole lot easier, with Charlotte and Georgia Tech remaining on their schedule. They'll be hoping that either Texas takes down Texas A&M or Alabama drops their game against Auburn, as either outcome basically guarantees their place in the SEC championship. But even if they don't make it there and drop their last game against Georgia Tech, they would still be in, so it doesn't really matter. Texas Tech dismantled UCF, who coincidentally has the same quarterback that Indiana had when they played Akron 2 years ago. I know Texas Tech is ranked 6th, but I still feel like they don't get the credit that they deserve. Do they play an SC-style gauntlet? No. but they still play very solid teams in the Big 12 and completely decimate all of them. They're beating teams by an average of 27.4 points per game, and their only loss came at Arizona State by 4 in a game they played without their starting quarterback. If this team can stay healthy, they could easily snag the 5 seed in the playoffs, beat the Group of 5 team, and really challenge whoever is in the 4 seed. Their road is also laid out right in front of them. They only have West Virginia in the regular season, and a win guarantees their spot in the Big 12 championship. A loss here, however, and they could definitely be left out with 2 losses due to their strength of schedule, but I would consider that a collapse, as they'll likely be favored by 3 scores. If they win that game and lose in the Big 12 championship, it'll be interesting, but the committee would have to drop them considerably to even fall out, and we saw with SMU last year that they probably wouldn't be quick to do that. Ole Miss was able to come from behind and take down Florida. It's very simple for Ole Miss at this point. Their tiebreakers frankly suck for the SEC because they had a very easy schedule compared to other teams, so it's likely that they'll be left out of the SEC championship even if they win their final game against Mississippi State. But with just 1 loss, they would be in anyway. Should they lose that game, things will be very dicey for them. As I mentioned, their strength of schedule isn't that great for the SEC. In fact, it'll be dead last after they play their game against Mississippi State. Looking at the rankings, they would have to be dropped beyond 10 to most likely be out, but it would be interesting to see if the committee would drop them behind the other teams that could have 2 losses like Oklahoma, Notre Dame, Alabama, or Vandy. The ESPN predictor, which honestly can be a pretty terrible tool at times, only gives Ole Miss a 50% chance to make the playoffs with a loss to Mississippi State. So take that as you will, but I definitely wouldn't want to be left at the mercy of the committee. Notre Dame just ran through Pitt on the big stage of College Game Day. While the Irish might have started the year slow with 2 losses, they've won their past 8 and have an argument for one of the hottest teams in college football. This was flat out a massive win for Notre Dame. With Syracuse and Stanford left, it seems like they got through their last major test on their way to the playoffs. Being ranked 9th in the CFP poll with these games remaining means they'll be in if they win out. I just don't see a world where teams outside this spot do enough to push them out. This is just the reality that we currently live in. I believe Notre Dame is a playoff caliber team, and I'll definitely get more hate for this from Notre Dame fans, but their ranking in the CFP poll just doesn't make sense to me. Their best wins are Pitt and USC, which leads me to believe that the committee is rewarding them for their high quality of losses against Miami and Texas A&M early in the year. Alabama and Vandy highlighted here also have 2 losses but a better strength of schedule than Notre Dame. And that doesn't even mention BYU, who has a harder schedule and only 1 loss, or Miami, who has 2 losses and beat Notre Dame. Don't get me wrong, I'm not some Notre Dame hater. Bonzie Colson and Manti Te'o were my favorite college athletes growing up. But when the argument boils down to, you guys lost to Florida State, or you guys lost to Louisville, and we lost to better teams, there is something wrong. I think Notre Dame will make the playoffs, and I think whoever draws them in the first round is going to be pretty pissed. But I couldn't make this video and not talk about some of the teams they currently rank ahead of. The last team in this group is Oregon. They did what they had to do against Minnesota and now have USC and Washington on their schedule. Lose both, they're out. Win both, they're in. Split them, and that's where it gets pretty dangerous. Right now, it does seem like we could be heading for a scenario where 2-loss teams, even from the SEC and Big Ten, can be in trouble. So if you're unfortunate enough to find your team in that position, the most you could hope for is that your team prove themselves in enough games they've won. Of course, a lot of teams still can and definitely will fall apart, and while I do think Oregon would be alright scraping in with 2 losses, it wouldn't be a total guarantee. Before moving into Control Their Destiny, I want to quickly shout out Nova and the Ball Knower on my website, CFB Spot. They beat my high score in guessing where players went to college, so shout out them. I also just want to quickly add that I made the same game on the site but for college basketball, so if that's more your style, check it out. I make $0 off these videos, so going on the website really helps me out a lot. Again, it's cfbspot.com. Let me know what else you guys would want to see over there. Alright, back to the video and into Control Their Destiny. Let's start with the controversial one, Alabama. They just lost at home to Oklahoma, which is why they moved down a tier here. They're still on 2 losses with the 4th hardest schedule in the country, which is why they're ranked 10th in the CFP and still in the projected bracket. But if they lose one more, I think it would be a lot like last year where they were left out with 3 losses. Looking at their schedule, they have Tony Romo and Jimmy Garoppolo's alma mater in Eastern Illinois, so not too bad. But then they have Auburn at their place in the Iron Bowl. If Alabama played any other unranked SEC team, they would be in the tier above. But this game always seems to have some dark magic in the air. Do I think Alabama will win this game? Absolutely. How would I feel going into this game as a Bama fan? Completely terrified. Should Alabama win out, they are likely to make the SEC championship with their tiebreakers, but even a loss there would be fine because the committee would never leave out the SEC loser, even if they had 3 losses. Let's look to the team they just lost to, Oklahoma. This was the biggest game for the Sooners in years, and they were able to pull it out, not only keeping their playoff hopes alive, but dramatically improving their odds. They jumped from likely being the first team out at 11th in the CFP poll all the way up to 8th. This gives them a slight cushion in the top 10, but they need to keep winning to get in, which won't be an easy task. They have Missouri at home this weekend, and while Missouri doesn't have a signature win to this point, this game could be tough. It might be different when this video comes out, but at the time of recording, it's rumored that quarterback Bo Pribula could return for this game. He got hurt in their game against Vanderbilt, and this would make things extremely interesting, but Oklahoma is still favored by a touchdown. Missouri somehow has only had to travel for 2 games so far this season, and they're 1-1, so I do like the Sooners' odds. Oklahoma would then take on LSU, which is a team we know has the talent on the roster to compete with anyone. With both of these games at home, Oklahoma will be favored. But one small slip-up, and they're more than likely finished. Next up, BYU. This is probably one of the top 3 most interesting teams in this playoff battle. They currently sit 11th in the CFP poll, just 1 spot outside of the projected playoffs, with the ACC and Group of 5 winner jumping them. But let me tell you about a little theory floating out there. We know the committee talks about not punishing conference losers because if they were to do that, a lot of teams would have the incentive to sit out those games, which would be detrimental to college football. So, imagine BYU wins out, beating Cincinnati and UCF. 2 solid wins, but with Cincy dropping against Arizona last week, they wouldn't be as good of a win as they once were. I believe it is extremely likely BYU would not move up into the top 10 at all. This would have them in the Big 12 final against Texas Tech, needing a win to push their way in. I get that I'm moving into a little bit of conspiracy theory territory, but look at what happened last year. The committee had SMU ranked within the at-large spots, and when they lost to Clemson in the ACC championship, the committee had to stay true to their word and not push them out, which forced Alabama to miss the playoffs. SMU went on to get smoked 38-10 by Penn State in a pretty forgettable game. All I'm saying is that the incentive would definitely be there for the committee to keep this team on the outside looking in, and they would have plenty of cover with Alabama currently being the team ranked directly in front of them. Tulane is the next team, and a lot of people were pretty shocked by the committee's decision. As you can see, they are the only Group of 5 team ranked within the CFP poll, which basically ensures that they'll make it if they win out and win the American Conference. This is pretty controversial because James Madison was the highest ranked Group of 5 team in the AP poll, yet they are nowhere to be seen here, but more on that later. They took down FAU this past weekend and have Temple this weekend and Charlotte the next. They're favored in both, and it's clear the committee thinks very highly of this team. Lastly, we have Georgia Tech. A barn burner against Boston College of all teams got the heart rate pumping for fans everywhere, but the Yellow Jackets held on to stay in the race. Their game against Pitt this weekend is the biggest of the year for them. A win and they're in the ACC championship, but with a loss they would have to pray that SMU and Virginia lose and that the tiebreaker gods look down on them favorably. Their final game against Georgia is interesting. For the sake of the argument, let's just say that they beat Pitt and lose to Georgia. They would have to win the ACC to get in, but if they beat Pitt and Georgia, they would have an at-large argument even if they lost the ACC. There is room for a lot of speculation about what the committee may or may not do here, but for now, they just have to beat Pitt to keep their fate in their hands. Moving down to teams that need a little luck, we have USC and Michigan. The teams in this category are not created equally, and these two are a good example of that. I'll start with USC because they're rated higher and have the head-to-head over Michigan. They fended off Iowa at home in a game that gave them a solid boost up to 15th in the poll. Still a little bit outside of that coveted top 10, which is why there is still some uncertainty. However, these two teams have what a lot of others don't: opportunity. The teams at the top of the poll would prefer to coast with easy games to lock up their spots, which means the teams on the bubble actually benefit from having really tough opponents on their schedules. In this case, USC has Oregon and Michigan has Ohio State. If USC beats Oregon, those teams would have the same record at 9-2, and USC would have a very legitimate argument for jumping over them. The only issue is the current gap. Would the committee drop Oregon enough for USC to also jump over some of the other teams in front of them? Maybe we'll find out after this weekend. Making the Big Ten championship is still in the cards, but they would also need Michigan to beat Ohio State. And staying with Michigan, they just had a comeback victory at Wrigley Field against Northwestern. But if they hope to make the playoffs, they need to win out and then hope for even more results to fall their way. They're unlikely to make the Big Ten championship even if they win out, as Indiana is a lock unless they lose to Purdue, and Michigan will be tied with the winner of the Oregon-USC game with worse tiebreakers than both. I expect their only path is beating Ohio State and praying that a win of that magnitude is enough to rocket them up the rankings. Not much has changed with Vanderbilt. They remain 14th in the CFP poll and are still eyeing a potential at-large bid. I'm a little worried that their remaining schedule with Kentucky and Tennessee just doesn't give them enough firepower to jump into the top 10 should they win out. So they'll need bubble teams like BYU to drop to Cincy, or Alabama to drop to Auburn, or Oklahoma to Missouri. They're definitely not out yet, but it'll be interesting to check in with them next week to see how things have changed, assuming they take down Kentucky this weekend. Now let's look at two teams who were outraged by the CFP poll: James Madison and North Texas. Both teams are 9-1 and find themselves not ranked, while 8-2 Tulane sits in the driver's seat at 24th. This doesn't mean much for North Texas, but it's devastating for JMU. This tells us that at least Tulane would have to slip up on their path to the AAC championship for them to even have a chance at making the playoffs, and that doesn't even account for where North Texas could be. Because of this, James Madison's odds to make the playoffs plummeted, but crazier things have happened. For now, they just have to win their games while hoping that the American Conference has a weak champ like East Carolina or USF. North Texas, on the other hand, really just has to win the American Conference and hope it's enough to punch their ticket. If they were to beat Tulane in the championship, that would be a ranked win, and even if JMU was ahead of them at that point, it would be a possibility that they would jump them. It's hard to say where these teams currently are as the committee left them out, but I guess I would give JMU the edge for now as they have the same record with a slightly harder strength of schedule. Utah is another one of these bubble teams with not a lot of firepower to finish their season. They'll likely need BYU to fall against Cincinnati to stand any sort of chance of making the Big 12 championship, but their odds of being an at-large bid are significantly better. Similar to Vandy, they just need to hope that the teams ahead of them forget how to play football and allow that to lift them up. Before we see the last three teams in this category, I want to quickly walk you through what I'm calling the "please God let this happen" scenario. Alright, stay with me here. In the ACC, over the next 2 weeks, if Georgia Tech loses to Pitt, Pitt loses to Miami, Virginia loses to Virginia Tech, SMU wins one and loses one against Louisville and Cal, Miami beats Virginia Tech, and Duke beats UNC and Wake Forest, there would be a 6-way tie for first place in the ACC. Assuming every other favorite won their game in the ACC, that would leave the championship with Duke and Miami due to conference opponent winning percentage tiebreaker. This would be absolute chaos. Every seemingly insignificant game, like Syracuse against Boston College or NC State against UNC, would now send ripple effects throughout the entire conference that would impact who would make the ACC championship. Can you imagine having to root for Bill Belichick's UNC team to save your team's hope at making the playoffs? How fun would that be for every single fan outside of the ACC? And honestly, this scenario doesn't even involve that many upsets. Virginia Tech against Virginia next week is maybe the hardest game, and that program could potentially be rejuvenated after putting pen to paper with James Franklin. So let's talk about three teams directly involved in that race: SMU, Virginia, and Miami. SMU is coming off of their bye week, while Virginia and Miami are coming off of wins against Duke and NC State respectively. Focusing on Virginia and SMU first, their only chance is through the ACC Championship. Should SMU win out and Virginia beat Virginia Tech, it is likely that Virginia would be the team to play in the ACC Championship against what we can assume will be Georgia Tech. This is because the Cavaliers currently hold the conference opponent win percentage tiebreaker over SMU. However, it is very close, so a few games like, say, Florida State losing to NC State this weekend could push the needle for them. Also, I forgot to mention it with Georgia Tech, but the reason they're ahead of SMU and Virginia in every three-way tiebreak scenario is because they all played one common opponent in Wake Forest. And Wake Forest beat SMU and Virginia. That's right, the fate of some ACC teams is literally being decided by Wake Forest of all teams. Anyway, wrapping up with Miami, their fate likely lies in an at-large bid. They can technically win the ACC with just 2 losses like the scenario we mentioned, but it's unlikely. Instead, they're kinda like Vanderbilt again and just need to win out while other teams on the bubble lose. I know I talked about Miami being behind Notre Dame last week, but there is something I didn't mention. I won't go into all of it, but the College Football Playoff Committee creates these rankings every single week by splitting teams up into groupings. From what I understand, it's a very complicated voting process, but it boils down to this. Groupings of 4, 4, 4, 4, and then 3, 3, 3 to get to the top 25. What it means is that they vote on teams, lock in the top 4, and then debate on where teams should be from there. Then they move on to the next 4, and the next, and the next. This is why we saw head-to-head matter so much last week, with teams like Michigan and USC being right next to each other, Alabama and Georgia next to each other, and Texas and Oklahoma. This also explains why Miami is not ahead of Notre Dame. They aren't in the same grouping. This means likely if Miami wins out and gets just close enough to be within striking distance of Notre Dame, the head-to-head factor could be there, allowing the Hurricanes to jump them. And it'll be very cool to see if something like that happens. Moving into Prey, let's finish the ACC. Pitt. Pitt lost a big one against Notre Dame, much to the chagrin of all the bubble teams. Now their only way in is by winning the ACC. They'll have to take down Georgia Tech and Miami to likely stand a chance, but they would also need one of SMU or Virginia to lose, as in a 3-way tie they would be third due to common conference opponent since they lost to Louisville, while the others will have won if SMU wins out. In the Big 12, we have Cincinnati, Arizona State, Houston, and Arizona in that order. Their only shot is through the Big 12 championship, and even then it's very slim. Arizona and Houston have to win out and have every team vying for a spot lose, but Cincinnati and Arizona State actually stand a chance. Both teams need Cincinnati to win this weekend against BYU, period. Obviously, a loss there would knock Cincinnati out, but Arizona State is also relying on them because if BYU wins, they would then need UCF to beat them and still have tiebreakers fall their way. So basically, the entire Big 12 is going to be watching this Cincinnati-BYU game, and if Cincinnati wins, things could get very interesting. Alright, let's go quickfire. Tennessee and Texas. In a year where 2-loss SEC and Big Ten teams are still fighting for their lives on the bubble, being a 3-loss team doesn't really bode well. Both obviously need to win out, but they also need multiple teams to just decide to quit playing football at the same time. So, see you next year. UNLV and San Diego State still have 2 losses and a mathematical chance to make the playoffs through the Group of 5 bid. However, they need a very weak American Conference winner and JMU to lose the Sun Belt. Both pretty unlikely. And lastly, in the American Conference, we have East Carolina, Navy, and USF. They all have relatively the same odds to win their conference, but even that doesn't guarantee their spot in the playoffs. They would likely need JMU to lose at least one more and maybe even hope that the Mountain West winner is weak. Expect a lot of teams down here to become a part of the Fallen next week. Alright, so just 2 weeks left, getting down to the real nitty-gritty here. Every week, what the committee decides matters more and more compared to the actual results of the games. And if things go the way they're going, this could lead to some very, very unhappy fan bases. The big games this weekend that I am paying very close attention to are Missouri, Oklahoma, USC, Oregon, Pitt, Georgia, and BYU, Cincinnati. I'll be at the Northwestern Minnesota game at Wrigley, likely freezing my balls off to watch some mediocre Big Ten play, and honestly, I can't wait. Really, just enjoy the season while it's still here. It'll be gone before you know it, and I'll see you next week.